Back in 1989, I met Dino Guissani for the first time. He had just completed his degree and was hoping to join a team of researchers that I worked in. It was based in Reading and led by pioneering researcher Dr. Mark Hansen. Now, around 3 and a bit decades later, he runs his own thriving team of researchers at the University of Cambridge. I caught up with him over lockdown. I was keen to discover what he remembered of his entry into PhD life, what drives him to remain in science, and what he thinks is needed if you're going to build a great research team. Going back to 1989 when you called in at the office, did you respond to a job advert, or did you just identify this as an area of research that you wanted to be involved with and came along speculatively?
It's very funny how it happened. I was still in my halls of residence in Royal Holloway in one of those many buildings that you helped me carry so many things in your estate car so many times to move. And I received a phone call, from a corridor.
Okay.
Someone saying, Dino, there's a Professor Hansen on the phone for you.
Yeah.
And I have no idea how that actually happened.
Okay.
I don't think I've ever really asked Mark how that happened. I knew I wanted to do a PhD, and I put some feelers out. And one day I got a call from Mark. We just received our grades, so we knew that the marks had come out, and he literally was, "Hi, Dino, my name's Mark Hansen. I'm interested in talking to you. We have 3 PhD positions opening. Could you come and spend some time with us in Reading?"
Yeah, he did the same to me. I was literally walking out of the building on my last day as an undergrad, and he asked me what I was planning to do with the rest of my life. I hadn't got any particularly fixed plans, so he said, "Well, how about staying and doing a PhD with me?"
Yeah. So
and at that point, I became a neurophysiologist.
So he must have some spies out there, I think, which I never really found out how exactly he came across that.
Well, I'd written a dissertation for him earlier in the course, so we'd sort of encountered each other that way, and I guess there's something in that sparked his interest.
Yeah.
But now, 10, 20, 30 years later, that's scary.
Yeah, it's 30 years later, yeah.
I mean, looking back on it, do you now see this as a job, a vocation, a calling, a passion?
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, is it a job? I don't think it is. Is it a calling? I definitely think it's a passion. Almost it transcends being passionate. Really, it's almost something that shapes you for life. So it is a way of life, I think. So if you don't breathe and think of science, and you don't eat and think of science, and you don't sleep and think of science, then it's just not for you. I think it is something that becomes you. I think it's it's a fast train with constantly moving goalposts, and all you can do is really try to keep up with it. So what I mean, I guess, is that if you're the sort of person that wants a really structured working day, from 9 to 5, then science is really not for you, and I guess the reason is because the scientific research, by its very nature, it's this unpredictable thing, this never-ending thing, which makes it at the same time really exciting. I was talking to some students and saying, I honestly cannot recall any day of my working life where, I had finished my work before 5 o'clock, and I was willing, looking at the clock and willing it to go to 5 o'clock so I could go home. I think it's more like all of a sudden you realize it's 6 o'clock. You have many things to do still, and you must think of actually trying to go home.
It's a matter of sort of tearing yourself away from it rather than desperate to get away.
Yeah, and the reason is, so it's just never ending. It's it arborizes, and therefore you can never really accomplish everything in that you plan to do. So all you can do is do as much as you can during the working day or the working hours, and try and shut the doors now and then. But it never really happens. So that's why I mean it becomes a way of life.
And you've now grown from being a PhD student at Reading to a professor in Cambridge, and built a team around you. How large is your team now?
At the moment, we're about 11 people.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what have you had to learn to move from that sort of individual pursuit of gaining your PhD and sort of fighting your little corner as a PhD student through to now nurturing others and drawing this mass together?
Yeah, it's a really interesting path, isn't it? That really one follows, and at the beginning it's very prescribed, I think. So if you want to be an academic, you finish your PhD, you try, and everyone tells you to move country if possible, certainly to move laboratory. The world's your oyster is a very exciting time of life, isn't it? Where you literally can go anywhere and choose where you want to be. So you land a postdoctoral fellowship that you spend 2 or 3 years at. You are productive during it, and then the next step is to land another postdoctoral fellowship, probably having worked in Chile, then you presumably want to go to the other end of the world and work somewhere else for 3 years.
And at this time it's narrowing slightly because not everybody manages to get the next step.
Yeah, that's right. And if you're lucky, you do that. And having covered those two jobs, as it were, and having been continuously productive at them, then of course you are eligible to try and land a permanent job. And once you land a permanent job, it's this sort of stark reality, isn't it? It's suddenly, and I do remember this at Cambridge. I was just sitting in my office and saying, "Oh my God, I need to be a boss now." So there is this huge transition from being an employee to being an employer.
Yeah.
And no one really teaches you that. That's what's missing in that career path. There is no one says, this is how you do things, this is how you administrate, this is how you talk to people, this is how you enthuse them, this is how you resolve problems. It's just absent. So I think...
and do you think that's still absent now?
I do. I really do. I think it's never been really covered. I think depends on the department that you join and the university that you join, that you have a sort of mentor academic looking after you. So if you are a lecturer, you usually get assigned in the department that I am in, physiology at Cambridge, you get assigned a professor to look after you. But it's it's very it's very nominal. It doesn't really, there is no active process there of passing on some wisdom on a week by week basis. So I think what you're left with then is to, what shapes you as a boss is the experience that you've had as a PhD student, the experience that you've had as a postdoc in your first postdoctoral fellowship, and the experience in your second postdoctoral fellowship. If you've been very lucky to have very supportive, senior postdocs shaping your PhD, you can draw from how they were. I've had after that, two, completely contrasting types of bosses, really supervisors, and I've gained huge qualities from each of them. And I think what has shaped the type of employer that I am, is basically an amalgamation of all those qualities and things that I didn't think were so good. You become a sieve of life, don't you? You just retain the things that you want to maintain and emulate.
Yeah.
And that is the type of person you become. I think I think some of the greatest challenges of also being a boss is, or a supervisor, is that in science, like we were saying at the very beginning, you have to have endless enthusiasm for the work that you do. You have to have endless motivation, and that now has to happen. You have to transmit that onto the people who work for you. Isn't this the most exciting thing that you're going to spend the rest of your life doing, working absolutely flat out to resolve it? And the reason is because it is so fresh, and so.
And if you pile in enthusiasm, it comes back multiplied from the other end.
It really does. It's sort of exponential, and of course this is the good and the bad things. So the bad things is you've been working on a paper for 7 years that still gets rejected, and you have to say to them, well, of course it did, because we didn't really address this. So it's not a problem. Let's carry on.
Yeah.
This is what we're going to do. Let's learn from this experience. We're still, the best team in the world, and we still do world-class science.
Yeah.
It's just, they're not quite getting it yet. So, let's carry on.
Pick yourself up, turn around, start again.
Really. And you can't afford, to become depressed yourself, because you now have a following to basically enthuse. And I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah.
I think another big challenge of being a supervisor or principal investigator is that there is a lot of administration in science, and we can quantify our life and work into 3 histograms. I think you have a sort of a research histogram output, which we love doing, and you have a teaching histogram that quite a lot of people love doing. I do, but it is slightly lower than the research histogram, and then you have the administration histogram that should be as high as the research histogram, but of course it's a sort of forever decreasing amount of time that we devote to that. And that can cause problems. I have to work at that. I have to assign myself an administration day where I maintain communication within the group, which is hugely important. I ensure that everyone knows what they're doing and which part they're playing in this team. I think if you become a scientist who's just at the bench, just at your desk, I mean, you miss a lot of things. And in the work that we do, I mean, I thankfully love doing the science that we do, and love still taking part in it, less and less so physically. But one of the things that I do all the time, for example, is still surgery. And that means that I spend 5 hours on the floor, at the same level as everybody, and it's a huge equalizer. In that time, I absorb a huge amount of information that I wouldn't have done otherwise, and that can sometimes lead to problems.
Because in my mind, you're effectively a CEO, a director in a SME, which is do you have any idea what your annual budget turnover is over the whole team?
Well, in terms of funding, I mean, we currently working with about grants that sum up to about £4 million over the course of 3-4 years. So you're working on a £1 million turnover per annum in a busy active lab, but it's very difficult to quantify.
People's lives sort of moving through that at the same time, which is exactly the same as I work in a sort of startup environment here with lots of little offices, and that's what everyone's doing, and trying to work out their corporate structure and their values, team values, and making that drive forwards. Do you have a sort of strategy plan that runs through, or is it just driven purely by the research? Each grant that you get can tag in?
There is always a lag, in the work that you do, because I mean, you obtain funding, and if you are very, very restrictive in the sense of doing the work that you're funded to do at that particular moment. It just doesn't work like that. You're always doing other things, other related things that can expand onto the renewal grant, as it were. So it cannot be that prescriptive. I think the overall strategy that I have is to get the most out of the funding that we have, and to get the most the study designs that we've created. We've been mindful of everyone, putting yourself, I think, in everyone's shoes. So think about it from a PhD student's perspective. Think about the science that we are doing from a postdoc perspective. One of the things that I have been very rigorous about implementing is providing a carrot for everyone, irrespective of the stage of their careers. And what got me thinking about that is that, if you have a large team, which is multidisciplinary, but you address, the same question at different levels, and everyone takes a part, then of course you have these multi-author publications, and postdocs suffer from that by, being middle author in 10 or 15 papers, but they are still middle author, one of many, and that provides some difficulty in terms of their own career path. And the PhD student usually, gets all the credit by being first author, and you of course are always last author, and so you think that everyone is happy. But I think what I have done in every piece of work and every program of work that we do, and you can do that because of the science is so broad, if you like, is then to have to say, well, within this program of work there are actually 11 different projects, and you as a PhD student will be in charge of this project, and you as a postdoc will be in charge of this project. So everyone works towards this sort of common, very large and impacting papers, but there are all these friendly fire papers, as I call it.
Okay.
That everyone can be first author, and I think that's been a huge recipe.
Okay.
For success.
And actually, I'm interested by that, because that's starting to use the paper as a magnet to draw good behavior towards. That it's got a communication function, but it's also got a strategic career, and also a team building function, that you can actually, so long as you sit down and map that out at the beginning. And then it strikes me you get to a place where people feel safe when they come into work, because they know where their credit's coming, they know which bit they're in charge of, and they're driving that. And when they're assisting somebody else in theirs, that's a sort of second order thing for them, but they've all got that prime order role and duty and job within it.
That's right. And I think something, that you can get caught in that process and retire doing this, but something that we don't do too well, I think, in science is to actively think of our senior postdocs and their next step.
Okay.
And I think I'm beginning now to sit with people and say, well, you worked with me for 5 years, and I think it's fantastic, and the last thing I want to do is to lose you. But you need to start thinking as to what you are going to contribute to the scientific world. How you're going to separate yourself from the Guissani lab, or and become your own entity. And you can do that constructively, again, depending on the field of science that you work in. For us, it's so broad that you can very easily create a new path, where you say, this is going to become, I think, your path and your idea, and it needs to be clearly identifiable as something that is new. And I get them to think about that. I get them, if you were organizing a conference, why would they invite you? If you sit yourself in 10 minutes, you can say, well, are you the brain expert? Are you the heart expert? Are you going to talk about hypoxia? Who's the endonutrition person? Who's the maternal obesity person? Who talks about infection? Which adjective are you going to be known for? and you
And
have
if
to
someone
work.
was introducing you to the stage,
Yeah.
what would it be their 90-second introduction?
Yeah, it's like, we need a cardiovascular person. Who should we ask? We need we need who's the expert in developmental kidney, so kidney development. So it's always those things. And
I see in that sort of territory, some of the things can be bought over from the commercial world, from the SME sole trader type of mindset. In how are you selling yourself into the community? And it's a strange sort of market, but it's still a market.
That's right.
And you need to have your unique selling point
Yeah.
that is internationally known. So how are you transmitting that? What tools are you using to get that known? And in what way are you building a network of the people who know you, so that jointly that network gives you a framework to move into the next space?
That's right, and to a certain extent, it's sort of you're governed by opportunity, I think, and opportunistic. I mean, the traditional path is where a postdoc adopt some ideas from the current lab and some ideas from their PhD, which of course was different, and you try to blend together into making a new path. So someone did was working with me and basically becoming an expert in developmental hypoxia, but the PhD was about the brain. So then they, instead of asking questions about developmental hypoxia in the heart, then of course they asked about developmental hypoxia in the brain. Having with the know-how of how to develop those ideas. So that's the most common route, where you develop a path for yourself, blending your PhD and postdoc experience together. But it's something that I get them to think about a lot, and they don't come up. It's not very easy for them to come up with original ideas that are not immediately identifiable as, well, that's what Guissani does anyway, isn't it? So,
and to what extent do you use a sort of pull from the funding organizations to see where their strategies and their priorities are going, to say, well, there's a few things I'd like to do, but actually the funders are trying to draw us into this direction? Because at the end of the day, you need quite a lot of money to make this run.
Yeah, you have to go where the money is, and you have to try to mold your ideas into a different particular funding course. But I think you have to also be look at funding as a way of life. I don't think you should and that is very much country dependent. What I mean by that, I think in the UK we're very lucky by having several sources of funding that have different deadlines, and they're quite broad. That's sort of Wellcome Trust. I mean, for me, obviously, with cardiovascular is the British Heart Foundation, but then you have the Medical Research Council, the BBSRC. So there are multiple avenues of funding, and so for me, grant applications are a way of life, where you are continuously writing papers, and I'm continuously writing grants, because it's a very competitive world, and people are very, very good, and if you're lucky, your hit rate is 1 in 6, and that therefore has to.
I see that very much in the sales territory. They've got a need. You've got some, which is a knowledge need. You've got a tool which can potentially resolve the knowledge need. So you're announcing that you are the most likely person or team to solve their core problem. And that needs to be written sort of clearly into the bid, but it needs to be genuine also, in terms of a belief that is actually what you're about. Otherwise, these applications look a bit thin when they arrive.
That's right. And that's very different in other countries. In the States, of course, it's governed by the National Institute of Health, and the same in Australia, where it's a sort of an annual call. So it is this sort of assiduous competition that happens every year. So so they go into colleagues of ours have always said, well, don't talk to me for the next 2 months, because we're grant writing, and that's a very different timeline in way of life than a scientific researcher here, I think, in the UK.
Okay, yeah, interesting. So how do you go about with identifying the research targets that you're going to drive for?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think it depends what sort of person you are, I think. But if I were to advise a lecturer starting in Cambridge, I would say, try to identify programs of work rather than projects. Think big and have a long perspective. This is your only time to be ambitious. Have dreams of grandeur, because they might become a reality. So you have to think of not incremental questions, but actually programs of work that literally may last decades, right? So I mean, for me, what excites me in science in particular, I guess, is work that is translational, that addresses the basics of scientific science underpinning not only disease, but also health, human disease and human health. I think if you identify targets that are not only interesting but palpable to everybody, that is a common problem with everyone. Heart disease affects 1 in 3 people. So then you ask questions, therefore, that are pertinent to everyone, and therefore people can see that. I think examples of work that are impacting, I guess, would also have some sort of interventional component to it. So it's not just the scientific mechanisms that are driving this disease, but we can try and cure it, offer some sort of prevention or treatment strategy, solution to the problem, potential cure. You can see that immediately grant awarding bodies and people interviewing you would then be saying, yeah, well, I can see why that's interesting. I think I guess another example of science, a scientific program of work that might be interesting is something that has a long perspective. Something that can impact not only this generation but future generations. Transgenerational work. So so in our field, we're very lucky about that. People ask me, well, what are you interested in? And I say, well, I'm interested in heart disease. Because it's one of the greatest killers in the world today. But I'm interested in heart disease with a twist. I'm interested in heart disease and how it may originate before birth. So it's still a gene environment interaction. But it's a gene early environment interaction.
It's even got to the point where there's now pre-birth interventions.
That's right. Preconceptual science, and then you'd say, well, if you think about it, and you talk to the British Heart Foundation, for example, or to clinicians nowadays, there is this growing change in perspective in medicine, in public health today, from treatment, where you can do very little, to prevention, when you can do quite a lot. And if you really want to try and resolve the problem, then there is no better form. If you're talking about developmental origins of heart disease, then you can bring that preventative strategy all the way back along the developmental trajectory, and if possible, try and bring preventive medicine back into the womb, as sort of an early origin of intervention. Most recently we found that you can not only increase the risk of heart disease or heart health by the quality of the environment in pregnancy, or as you say, preconceptually, but also that we can transmit, the risk of heart disease across generations, or even protection against it across generations. So you suddenly think of this idea that is so big, isn't it? It's sort of, you say, well, we have this wonderful opportunity really to not only influence the cardiovascular health of our children, but their children and their children's children. So it's mind-boggling, isn't it? It literally has something that has a 30 to 40-year perspective, if not at the 100-year problem. And that's exciting to think about. So how you unpack a scientific idea into something that will become a program of work that shapes your scientific life is to think that big, to think about things that you can resolve and cure, and how you're going to do that, to things that might impact health from one generation to the other.
Okay. Dino, Professor Guissani, I think that's a really good place to stop, with that notion that what we do now has the excitement of just driving things through to the future. So thanks a lot for your time, and I've enjoyed bumping into you again.
That's always a pleasure, Peter.